Okay, so I had my internship with WMBS lined up back in basically the summer of last year, back in August of last year. When I had it lined up, I went in for an interview with the station manager, Brian Rosiak. We had a great meeting. He said, yep, whenever you want to do this next semester, we'll have you ready to go. And it seemed like it was pretty much set in stone. And then, of course, COVID-19 hits. So I'm on the phone. I'm literally calling Professor Krause from my basement saying, what are we doing with this? Are we still happening? Is this still a thing? What's going on? So he says, call your site, try and figure things out. And they were absolutely fine with me continuing my internship on time. As soon as we moved out of the red phase, I was good to go, and everything was smooth sailing from then on out to a certain extent. So a little bit of background about the station. WMBS was founded back in 1937 in Uniontown. This is the station itself. It looks like a regular house, and basically it is a regular house. So you walk up these steps and you go through the front door there. And at first it looks like a radio station. You have your receptionist sitting at the desk. You have your newsroom on the right as soon as you walk in. Then you have the station itself, and then you have our recording room, which I'll get into later. But as soon as you walk up the steps, it's a regular house. It's a full conference room, but it's basically a living room with regular tables and chairs. One of the bathrooms actually had a tub in it. I'm not making this up. It had a tub in it. The other one had a shower, so it was basically set up like a regular house. So on the air, they're on the air 24/7, 365, and they give out local news, sports, and talk shows, and what they consider America's best music. Most of us probably don't listen to it. It's probably more up Professor Krause's alley than anybody else's here. But WMBS has been one of the more decorated stations locally. They've been honored 13 times since 2010 by the Pennsylvania Association of Broadcasters. So here's a typical day at the office for me. I arrive around 9:30 a.m. and I meet with my supervisor, Bill Madden. Now, Bill is basically the guy that I work with the entire time. And we start our day off by recording the obituaries. So basically, Bill's going to pull out the paper. He's going to read, okay, so-and-so passed away at age whatever. This is his family and friends. Here are the funeral arrangements. And obviously, that was difficult because some of them didn't end up having funerals because of COVID. They didn't want people gathering together. Some of them had limited capacity. Some of them just said, show up whenever. And I had to edit all that together. So eventually, it wasn't a very difficult concept. I used what was referred to, I think it was Cool Word 2000 was what we ended up using. And it was very simple for the most part. Eventually, you do it for long enough and you start to pick up little things. Like I would pick up whenever Bill would take a breath. Okay, Bill just breathed right there, so now I gotta edit that out. And you condense it as much as you can. That way, it runs in time with the newscast properly. So for the next 2 hours, my job is to find news stories. Now, with WMBS, I was lucky enough that they let me go on the air and give sports and weather reports. That was probably the coolest part of all this. Obviously, with a typical internship, what they would have us do is they'd have the interns go out and cover like news conferences or local things going on around the area. Obviously, nothing's happening because of COVID, so they said, here, we're just going to get you your experience and we'll let you go on the air. So my job at first was to find news stories for Bill. So I had to go on to their forum that they used. Basically, it was Pennsylvania News or something along those lines. And I find the stories for him. I type up the scripts, just like Lenny Fraterius taught us to do many times, and just send them off to him and mark out the sound bites as well that we would use because he doesn't always, Bill said that he didn't always want to be the one talking because eventually if you keep hearing the same voice over and over again, it will become monotonous, so you want to hear someone else. So we pull an audio clip of someone else giving the news and he just give a little intro to it. So during that time also you look at the news wire just to see if anything else would update. If you ever have breaking news stories, sometimes we have like accidents around the Uniontown, so they need you to report that as well, so that's what I did also. As far as myself and gathering sports stories for my reports, it's pretty hard to gather stories for sports reports when there are no sports being played. There were times where I was absolutely reaching just to find anything. I'm just fishing to find a story. I'm praying that some athlete's gonna post something stupid on Twitter, and luckily I got some help with Drew Brees on that one. Another time was I had to wait and see, okay, maybe someone donated to charity or he's donating to COVID relief funds. There were days whenever I would literally have to pull stories from across the pond, like get stories about sports going on in Europe. And I remember Bill telling me, he said, "Why are you talking about stories going on in Europe?" And I was like, "Bill, there's literally nothing else to choose from. There's nothing going on here. I have to choose. I have to use this." There were days where I was talking about Formula One racing. I've never watched a Formula One race in my life, and yet now I have to report on it, and I have to butcher these names that are being thrown at me. It definitely had its moments where it was pretty rough. So then from 12 to 1 was basically showtime. Around 12:40 I would give my sports and weather reports, and there was nothing cooler than giving that first sports report and having family members, old high school teachers, or whoever reaching out to you saying, "Hey, I just heard you on the radio, you sounded amazing, great job." That was probably the coolest part of all of it, is hearing people just recognizing you for what you're doing and appreciating what you're doing as well. That was probably the coolest part of all of it. As far as learning how to operate the board, I did that more during the second half of my internship. I worked Wednesday nights. They would replay old sporting events. I remember I got to rebroadcast Lanny Frateri's first Major League Baseball broadcast, so that was pretty cool. Then there were times where eventually towards the end the Pirates did actually start playing, so unfortunately I had to listen to that for 3 hours a night, so that was kind of rough. But for the most part, it was the board was pretty similar to ours here at Waynesburg. There wasn't much of a difference. I think some of the main differences are there were obviously more buttons to use. So, for example, obviously they have more commercials at WMBS, so you have to plug those in, and they're going to go 3 in a row, as opposed to Waynesburg, where you just slide it over. Like, they already have it set up, so it was pretty cool. Now, Fridays were my busy days. Those were the days where everything is hectic and we have so much going on. So Fridays at 1, I would be one of the co-hosts for the show Hot Topics with Kendall and Bill. Now, Kendall is not an official employee of WMBS. She actually works at a hair salon, I believe, but for some reason she had a connection to the station, so they said, "Sure, come on in, you can have a show with Bill." And she was an absolute sweetheart. She was great to me. There were times she always joked about me having to get her lunch because I was the intern, of course, but she never actually paid me. There were days where she actually brought in lunch one day and was like, "Here, just eat it." So I was literally on the radio. We were both eating like chicken salad sandwiches, so it was pretty funny. Yeah, but overall that was a great experience. And then after that, I was also one of the co-hosts for the Democratic Hour. That one I didn't really speak as much. That one was mainly focused on the other host. His name was George Huckert. I had known him in the past from whenever I played golf at Connellsville. He worked at the golf course there, so he and I knew each other a little bit. So we had some discussions there. I took callers for both, and some of them were more interesting than others. We had, for the Hot Topics show, there was one lady who would call in every time. She called herself the hometown hottie. And she had, I swear, she had her own theme song, and it would play while she was talking, and she wouldn't even talk about anything that was going on in the news. Like with Hot Topics, we're supposed to focus on, okay, here's what's going on in America today. With this, it was just, she would call in and say, "Oh yeah, I'm hanging out with the grandkids today, and I actually got to, did my mom send you that recipe yet, Kendall? Did she get that?" It's like a regular conversation. We're literally on the air having it, so that was pretty cool. As far as the Democratic Hour was concerned, there were some hostile callers there. A lot of Republicans called into that show to dispute, and obviously during an election year it was pretty hectic. I think probably the craziest call we got during that time was when we had an individual, this was while all the riots were going on after the George Floyd incident. He called into the station and threatened to burn it down. We had that call, yeah, so had to put the fire on that situation pretty quick, but yeah, it was just, you never know what you're going to expect whenever you get these callers calling in. But I think the one thing that I took from this the most, especially with the Hot Topic show, is the people that we met. We had people from all over the community come in, and whether it was law enforcement or whoever. We had one individual named Dalen McLeod. He rescued a police officer from a burning vehicle, and Dalen was an African American who had a criminal record, and this was like probably a week or two after the George Floyd incident, and people just ate this up and they thought it was really cool, and Dalen just gave the perspective basically that it shouldn't matter what race I am. At the end of the day, I'm being a human, I'm being a good person. I think that's all that should matter, and it gave you a really good perspective on life. We met people who were part of, I guess, crime watch in Uniontown, and they held like celebrations for Juneteenth to, basically bring the community together. They held peaceful protests and such. They had peaceful marches throughout Uniontown. It was a very touching thing. We had another guy who came in. He collaborated with a student at a high school, and they wrote this children's book, and they weren't selling it for anything. Any profit they made, they were giving it away to charity. It's just, you meet some of the coolest people during this time. Reflections for me, personally, it wasn't just limited to what I did, preparing newscasts and going on the air. There were some other things I had to do as well. Because I am the intern, I'm doing all the grunge jobs that no one else wants to do and no one else can do, really. I'm the youngest one there. I'm probably most able to do it. There were times where, okay, we have a wire that's out of place, and you got to climb onto this ledge and straighten it out, make sure that our signal's still going through, so that's always fun. There was one day where our recording room was just absolutely packed with trash, so Brian said, okay, you and the other intern, Kylie, you two come down here, you're cleaning the whole thing out. That took 3 hours, but it was absolutely spotless after. And also I had to cover a couple of news conferences. That was tough to get through because they're all virtual, and it's basically just them repeating, okay, this motion passed, it carries, good to go. So overall, that was some other things I had to do involved with the station. As far as how I felt about it, I took a lot of lessons from it. Learn from your mistakes is obviously the main one. There was one time where I saved the obituary file to the wrong one, so it played the previous days. So Bill literally had to go run, grab the newspaper, and read word for word off of that, of who passed away that day. So that was, a bit of a slip up on my end, but you got to handle it. And there were times where I would post COVID-19 numbers, as you guys saw on the slide previously, and I would completely butcher that as well. And people would tell me, but Brian would tell me specifically, okay, Nolan, here's the format, here's how I want you to write this out, follow it word for word. That's another lesson you learn. If they have a specific way of wanting you to do it, you have to follow that way. So overall, I did enjoy my time with WMBS. It was very productive. One of my biggest things was that anytime I learned anything communications related, I'd always been in like a supervised environment, I guess. Whether it was at high school or Waynesburg, I always had someone that was kind of showing me how to do things. Now it's like, okay, I'm applying what I've learned here into the real world, and for the most part, I think I did a pretty decent job of it, and I definitely still want to be part of this industry, and I really enjoyed my time this summer. Thank you.
Okay, questions from the audience?
You kind of piqued my interest with the Democratic Hour. Kind of give me like the background. What was it specifically like? I guess just the background of the show, what it's about, essentially.
So basically, George Huckabee is the host. His sister Sylvia would call in from her house because she was too scared to go out because of COVID, so she would call into the show. And they had a doctor, Dr. O'Reilly, would show up too, and they would basically discuss what was going on in America for the most part, and they would, I'll be completely honest, the hour was mostly spent bashing Donald Trump for the most part, but overall it was a pretty interesting experience. For those shows specifically, I had to set up a camera because they like to live stream a lot of things on Facebook. So with them, I got to use Bill's phone, set it up, that way we're streaming. Kendall made Hot Topics she wanted to be like an extravagant production. I kid you not, she would walk in with one of those little circle spotlights that you see that the TikTokers use, and she would just set it up right here, right by the table. She's like, we set up the iPad to record, and she's like, okay, Nolan, turn up my brightness. I don't like how this looks. And I'm literally just, fidgeting with that the entire time, trying to make it work, so I can add camera work to my resume now also.
How did you deal with the sort of radical calls you would get from people listening?
Well, being being the intern, there's not much you can say. You know, you just got to handle it. You know, sometimes you just got to sit back and like, okay, that's how you feel. All right, you know, you're entitled to that opinion. Most of the time, Bill would just click them off if they started saying anything arrogant, and that was really all you could do about it. You see, no one dropped any f-bombs or anything on the air. Thank goodness. That would have been bad. But for the most part, you know, you don't get those calls very often. It happened maybe once every 2 weeks or so, but they do happen. So you just got to take it in stride.
Now, I grew up years and years ago listening. My dad would have MBS on because of weather reports primarily. But they also used to do a lot of local sports programming. To what extent do they still have that in play? And would this internship potentially open a door where you can get involved with them whenever they do on the sports side of things?
That was an option that I looked at. I did think about that because obviously Brian is pretty much the sports guy. He handles all the high school sports that they broadcast and such. And I did look into it to a certain extent. At the end of the day, it just wasn't in the cards as far as with COVID protocols and everything.
Sure.
So it was definitely an option I had considered. I was thinking, okay, you know, originally whenever I applied for this back in the previous summer, I thought, okay, if everything works out here, you know, these guys will bring me on their staff, and then I'll get paid to do it. And you know, I dream all this up in my head, and then of course it doesn't happen anything like that. But they still cover high school sports to a certain extent, obviously. I'm sure they still do, but just for me personally, it wasn't in the cards to get involved. Had everything gone according to plan, I think it would have been possible.
Project forward though. Will this provide an opportunity for you down the road? Now, there's your work. You were there all summer. And if they're going to be doing football, again, next fall, if they're going to be doing spring sports, for example, maybe Utah baseball, whatever, would there be an in for you? Do you think there's that kind of opportunity here?
I'd definitely knock on that door. Yeah, I'd definitely consider it. It just depends on if they'd be willing to bring me in or not, probably.
Some of the greatest sports announcers got their first jobs in small markets. I think I might have told you that Dan Patrick's father, Mike, who was just a tremendous play-by-play guy, the first football game he ever did was in Turkey, of all places. So think about that.
Yep.
So, okay, a round of applause, please.